What happens when one of comedy's brightest stars becomes one of its most polarizing figures? Amy Schumer's journey from celebrated trailblazer to heavily criticized comedian is a story of highs and lows that feels almost Shakespearean in its scope. Once hailed for her bold, unfiltered humor and groundbreaking take on societal norms, she now tops lists of the most divisive comedians of all time. But how did it all go so wrong? Is it her repetitive jokes and controversial humor that alienated audiences? Did her political stances overshadow her talent? Or was it her response to criticism that sealed her fate? And perhaps the most compelling question of all, can Amy Schumer ever reclaim the spotlight she once commanded so effortlessly? Let's dive in. Amy Schumer's rise to fame was nothing short of meteoric. She didn't just step onto the comedy stage, she burst onto it, commanding attention with her sharp wit, brash humor, and unapologetic confidence. For a while, it seemed like she could do no wrong. Her jokes, often self-deprecating and infused with a raw, feminist edge, struck a chord with audiences who were ready for something fresh. Amy wasn't just a comedian, she was a cultural phenomenon in the making. Back in the early 2010s, Amy was climbing the ranks of the comedy world, starting in small clubs and eventually landing her big break on Last Comic Standing. Her bold, no-holds-barred approach to comedy quickly set her apart from others on the circuit. She wasn't afraid to delve into taboo subjects, and for a while this audacity worked in her favor. The raw honesty in her humor felt refreshing to many, and it didn't take long for her to become a regular on the stand-up circuit. This was the Amy that people were rooting for, the underdog with a sharp tongue and a knack for turning everyday insecurities into punchlines. Her big breakthrough came with Inside Amy Schumer, a Comedy Central show that premiered in 2013. The show was an instant hit, blending sketch comedy, interviews, and stand-up in a way that felt innovative. It wasn't just another comedy series, it was a mirror held up to society, reflecting the absurdities of gender dynamics, beauty standards, and more. For many, Amy's sketches offered something that comedy had been missing, a female voice that didn't shy away from the messiness of real life. Critics praised her for being edgy and relatable, and soon she became the face of modern feminist comedy. By 2015, Amy was everywhere. Her stand-up specials were drawing huge crowds, and her name became synonymous with boundary-pushing humor. That year, she was included in Time's prestigious list of the 100 most influential people in the world. It was a monumental moment, solidifying her as more than just a comedian. She was a cultural icon, a voice for a generation that wanted comedy to challenge the status quo. Her comedy special Live at the Apollo, directed by Chris Rock, further cemented her status as a powerhouse. Critics lauded her for her sharp delivery and fearless exploration of personal and societal issues. The special was a culmination of years of hard work, showcasing a comedian at the height of her powers. Audiences loved her because she felt real. She wasn't some untouchable celebrity. She was the woman who'd share embarrassing anecdotes about her dating life or body image struggles, making everyone feel a little less alone in their own imperfections. But fame has a way of amplifying not just your strengths but also your weaknesses. As Amy's star rose higher, the cracks in her comedic persona began to show. Some viewers started to notice a pattern. Her jokes, while bold and boundary-breaking at first, began to feel repetitive. The self-deprecating humor that had once endeared her to audiences was starting to wear thin. While Amy's willingness to tackle taboo topics like body image and sex was initially refreshing, it also pigeonholed her. The same boldness that had propelled her to stardom was now being labeled as one-dimensional. Critics began to argue that her material lacked diversity, focusing too much on personal anecdotes and raunchy humor. Her sketches often revolved around her appearance, her sexual escapades, and her struggles with body image. What once felt raw and empowering was beginning to feel like overkill. For some, it was less of a fresh perspective and more of the same joke told in slightly different ways. Yet despite the murmurs of criticism, Amy remained a dominant force in comedy. Her audience was still showing up, her specials were still drawing crowds, and her show was still a hit. In 2015, she co-wrote and starred in Trainwreck, a semi-autobiographical romantic comedy that received critical acclaim. Directed by Judd Apatow, the film was a box office success, earning over $140 million worldwide. Amy's performance was praised for its honesty and vulnerability, and it seemed like she had successfully transitioned from stand-up star to Hollywood powerhouse. But even in the midst of her success, the seeds of controversy were being planted. Fame is a double-edged sword, and for Amy, the very things that had made her a star were starting to work against her. The repetitive themes in her comedy, while initially her strength, were now being viewed as her biggest flaw. The same public that had celebrated her boldness began to tire of her constant focus on herself. What was once empowering began to feel self-indulgent. The shift in perception was subtle at first. Fans who had once cheered her on started to voice mild frustrations, often couched in compliments. "Amy's great," they'd say, "but does every joke have to be about her body or her love life?" These comments, while not damning, hinted at a growing fatigue. It wasn't that people didn't like Amy anymore, they just weren't as enamored as they used to be. What made this turn of events particularly interesting was how many seemed to handle it. She wasn't one to shy away from criticism. If anything, she leaned into it, often using the backlash as fodder for her jokes. This self-awareness endeared her to some but alienated others. It was a tricky balancing act, and for a while she managed to walk the tightrope with finesse. As 2016 approached, Amy was still riding high, but the murmurs of dissent were growing louder. It wasn't just about her comedy anymore. Questions about her authenticity and her ability to evolve as a performer were beginning to take center stage. Would she adapt to the changing tides, or would she double down on what had worked for her in the past? Her story was far from over, but the cracks were undeniable. Amy Schumer, the once beloved underdog, was now at a crossroads. The next chapter of her career would determine whether she could maintain her status as a trailblazer or whether she'd be remembered as a comedian who rose fast and fell even faster. As Amy Schumer's fame continued to rise, so did the scrutiny. It wasn't just her success that was grabbing headlines. It was also the growing chorus of criticism aimed at her comedic style. What had once been celebrated as bold and refreshing was now being labeled as repetitive and uninspired. The jokes that initially set her apart were starting to feel like a running gag that refused to evolve. A significant portion of her comedy revolved around self-deprecation, which initially made her relatable. Audiences appreciated her willingness to poke fun at herself, to share the messy, unvarnished details of her life. But as time went on, the formula began to wear thin. Instead of feeling empowering, her humor started to sound like a broken record. For some, it became less about laughing with her and more about cringing at the predictability of her punchlines. Critics weren't shy about pointing this out. Social media threads and forums became rife with discussions dissecting her routines. Comments like, "How many jokes about her body can one person take?" or "She's a one-trick pony with no new material" became increasingly common. Fans who once celebrated her candor now found themselves rolling their eyes at yet another joke about her personal life. The very thing that made her stand out was now turning audiences away. This wasn't just a problem of repetition. Her humor also seemed to alienate certain demographics, particularly men. Many male viewers felt targeted by her jokes, which often portrayed them in a less than flattering light. While comedy has always had an element of punching up or down, Schumer's consistent focus on emasculating men left some feeling excluded from the laughter. Even some female fans found themselves growing tired of the constant focus on her body, her relationships, and her sex life. The jokes stopped feeling groundbreaking and started feeling like overkill. Yet despite the grumbling, Amy's star power remained undeniable. Her Comedy Central show, Inside Amy Schumer, was still drawing viewers, and her stand-up specials continued to pack venues. She was at the height of her popularity, even as the cracks in her comedic persona began to show. The release of Trainwreck in 2015, her semi-autobiographical rom-com, was both a critical and commercial success, earning praise for its sharp writing and Schumer's performance. For many, this was proof that she was more than just a stand-up comedian. She was a multi-talented force to be reckoned with. But with greater visibility came greater expectations, and Amy's ability to meet them was increasingly called into question. Audiences began to ask, was this all she had to offer? Could she adapt, or was she destined to keep recycling the same material until it lost all its charm? The answers to these questions would soon become clearer, but not in the way her fans had hoped. The first major sign of trouble came with her transition from comedy to activism. Amy Schumer had never shied away from expressing her political opinions, but as her fame grew, so did the platform she used to share them. What started as occasional quips about gender equality and societal norms turned into full-blown political commentary. For some fans, this shift was a welcome addition to her repertoire. For others, it marked the beginning of the end. The 2016 U.S. presidential election proved to be a turning point. During a performance in Tampa, Florida, Schumer launched into a tirade against then-presidential candidate Donald Trump. The reaction was swift and brutal. Around 200 audience members walked out of the show. For a comedian whose career was built on making people laugh, this was a devastating blow. The walkout made headlines, sparking debates about whether comedy and politics should mix. Schumer, however, didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down, using her platform to promote her political beliefs even more fervently. She announced her pregnancy in 2018 by posting a list of political candidates she supported, tying her personal life to her activism in a way that felt jarring to some fans. The backlash was immediate. Critics accused her of alienating her audience by pushing a political agenda, while supporters defended her right to speak out. The criticism wasn't limited to her politics. As her career progressed, Schumer began to face accusations of hypocrisy. While she publicly supported progressive ideals, some pointed to her earlier career moves as evidence of inconsistency. For instance, her first major television appearance was on Fox News, a network widely associated with conservative politics. This revelation didn't sit well with her liberal fan base, many of whom felt betrayed by what they perceived as a lack of authenticity. Even her humor, once her greatest asset, was now being dissected through a political lens. Some claimed her jokes about gender and relationships perpetuate negative stereotypes, while others argued that her focus on self-deprecation undermined the very empowerment she claimed to champion. The debates were endless, and Schumer found herself at the center of a cultural firestorm. Her response to the criticism often left much to be desired. Instead of addressing the feedback head-on, she frequently deflected by blaming her detractors. Comments about her lack of comedic evolution or her polarizing political statements were dismissed as misogyny or political bias. This only served to alienate more of her audience, who felt their concerns were being ignored or trivialized. As 2017 approached, it became increasingly clear that the public's perception of Amy Schumer was shifting. She was no longer the underdog comedian who could do no wrong. Instead, she had become a polarizing figure, adored by some and reviled by others. Her career was still going strong, but the foundation on which it was built was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. By this point, Amy's story was no longer just about her rise to fame. It was about the challenges of staying at the top, the pressures of public scrutiny, and the consequences of failing to adapt. Her comedy, once celebrated for its boldness, was now a source of division. The very qualities that had made her a star were now threatening to undo everything she had worked so hard to achieve. By 2016, Amy Schumer's career was at a critical juncture. She had become a household name, a comedian whose work was both celebrated and scrutinized. But fame, as many have learned, is a double-edged sword. For Amy, the very qualities that had propelled her to stardom were now drawing her into controversy after controversy. And nothing highlighted this shift more clearly than her increasing involvement in politics. Amy had always been vocal about her beliefs, but the 2016 U.S. presidential election brought this side of her personality to the forefront. Her disdain for Donald Trump was no secret, and she didn't hesitate to incorporate her political views into her comedy routines. At a Tampa, Florida show during her stand-up tour, she made scathing remarks about Trump, encouraging members of the audience who disagreed to leave. Around 200 people took her up on the offer, walking out mid-performance. While some applauded her boldness, others saw it as alienating and unprofessional. The Tampa walkout became a headline-grabbing moment. For many comedians, politics and satire are natural bedfellows, but Schumer's approach seemed to polarize rather than unify. Those who once laughed at her relatable humor now found themselves debating her political choices. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from praise for her bravery to outright disdain for her so-called agenda. Some fans felt betrayed, not because of her opinions, but because they felt the comedy stage wasn't the right venue for political grandstanding. But Amy was undeterred. Instead of shying away from the backlash, she leaned into it, using her platform to voice her opinions even louder. She publicly supported Hillary Clinton, interviewed her during the election cycle, and openly criticized the Republican Party. While this earned her accolades from some corners, it alienated a significant portion of her audience. Schumer's critics argued that her comedy was becoming a vehicle for personal beliefs rather than entertainment. For a comedian whose career was built on relatability, this was a dangerous turn. Adding fuel to the fire was the way she tied her personal milestones to political messaging. In 2018, she announced her pregnancy on Instagram by posting a list of political candidates she endorsed, with a casual note at the end: "I'm pregnant." While some applauded her ability to blend personal and political narratives, others saw it as opportunistic. To critics, it felt like another example of Amy putting her political agenda ahead of her connection with her audience. And yet it wasn't just politics that were drawing ire. Around this time, accusations of hypocrisy began to surface. While Schumer had built her brand as a progressive feminist comedian, her early career choices didn't always align with this image. For instance, her first major television appearance was on Red Eye WTOR's Greg Gutfeld, a late-night show on Fox News. This revelation didn't sit well with her liberal supporters, many of whom saw Fox News as the antithesis of their values. Schumer's detractors accused her of pandering to whichever audience would further her career, regardless of the values she claimed to uphold. This inconsistency extended beyond her political affiliations. Critics began to revisit her earlier stand-up routines, pointing out moments that seemed to contradict her current persona. Jokes that once passed without much notice were now being dissected under a microscope, with some arguing they undermined her claims of being a progressive feminist voice. Schumer's attempts to address these criticisms often fell flat. Instead of engaging in meaningful dialogue, she deflected, blaming much of the backlash on misogyny or political bias. While there's no denying that female comedians face unique challenges, this defense didn't sit well with everyone. Many felt she was using feminism as a shield against legitimate critique, which only deepened the divide between her and her audience. What made this period even more tumultuous was her apparent unwillingness to accept feedback. When her comedy or political statements were criticized, she often dismissed her detractors as part of the alt-right or accused them of harboring sexist motives. This approach alienated not only conservative viewers, but also moderate fans who felt their concerns were being trivialized. For a comedian whose early success was built on relatability, this perceived defensiveness was a significant misstep. As the backlash mounted, so did the scrutiny of her comedy itself. Some fans who had initially supported her were now questioning whether her material was as original as it seemed. Allegations of joke theft began to surface, with compilation videos on YouTube comparing her routines to those of other comedians. These videos highlighted striking similarities between her work and jokes by figures like Patrice O'Neal and Kathleen Madigan. While Schumer vehemently denied these allegations, even offering to take a polygraph test to prove her innocence, the damage was done. In the court of public opinion, the mere suggestion of plagiarism was enough to tarnish her reputation. The controversy surrounding these allegations was further compounded by the way she addressed them. In an Instagram post, she dismissed the claims as baseless and accused her critics of trying to tear her down. While some appreciated her confidence, others saw it as an unwillingness to engage with the issue seriously. Schumer later appeared on the Jim Norton Advice Show, where she reiterated her innocence, claiming she was so careful about not stealing material. Despite these efforts, the allegations lingered, casting a shadow over her career. This period marked a clear turning point for Amy Schumer. The comedian who had once been celebrated for her relatability and authenticity was now seen by many as defensive, hypocritical, and out of touch. Her comedy, which had once felt fresh and empowering, was increasingly viewed as repetitive and self-serving. For a performer who had built her brand on breaking boundaries, it seemed as though she was now struggling to evolve. By the end of 2017, Amy's career was still going strong in terms of visibility, but her public perception was undeniably fractured. Her comedy specials continued to draw viewers, and she remained a prominent figure in the entertainment world. But the growing chorus of criticism was impossible to ignore. The question was no longer whether Amy Schumer could make people laugh. It was whether she could reclaim the trust and admiration of an audience that was beginning to turn away. By 2017, the cracks in Amy Schumer's public image had become too large to ignore. While she was still a major player in the comedy world, the criticisms that had begun as murmurs were now a deafening chorus. Her political outspokenness, accusations of joke theft, and perceived defensiveness were only part of the story. What truly began to solidify her polarizing reputation were the growing tales of entitlement and alienating behavior. One such incident took place at an upscale gym in New York City, where Schumer reportedly refused to follow the standard check-in procedure. According to witnesses, she balked at the idea of presenting her membership card, allegedly declaring, "I'm famous," when staff didn't immediately recognize her. The story, which made its way to media outlets, painted a picture of a celebrity who believed the rules didn't apply to her. While Schumer didn't publicly address the incident, the damage to her reputation was already done. It became one more anecdote in a growing list of stories that portrayed her as out of touch. Not long after, she faced backlash for her interactions with fans. In one particularly publicized incident, Schumer announced that she would no longer take selfies with fans after an unpleasant encounter in Greenville, South Carolina. She claimed a man had run up to her, startled her, and refused to back off despite her requests. Schumer described the man as disrespectful, explaining that his behavior was why she was done with fan photos. However, when the man was later interviewed, he shared a different perspective, suggesting that Schumer had overreacted. While the truth likely lay somewhere in the middle, the story became another example of how Schumer's actions were increasingly being interpreted in the worst possible light. These incidents added fuel to a perception that Amy Schumer was entitled and ungrateful, a narrative that only gained traction when news broke about her Netflix deal. In 2017, Schumer signed an $11 million deal with the streaming giant for her stand-up special, The Leather Special. While $11 million might seem like a massive payday to most people, Schumer reportedly felt it was unfair. She pointed out that comedians like Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle had received $20 million each for their specials, and argued that her pay should be closer to theirs. The backlash to her demands was swift and unforgiving. Many pointed out that while Rock and Chappelle were comedy legends with decades of groundbreaking work behind them, Schumer was relatively new to the scene. The outrage wasn't just about the money, it was about what her demand seemed to symbolize, an inflated sense of self-worth that didn't align with her perceived talent. Social media erupted with comments mocking her audacity, with one user quipping, "Amy Schumer wants Chris Rock money but hasn't put in Chris Rock work." To make matters worse, the special itself was poorly received. The Leather Special was criticized for being repetitive and uninspired, with many feeling it offered nothing new. IMDb users rated it 3.1 out of 10, and Netflix reportedly adjusted its rating system to prevent low scores from deterring viewers. The backlash to her special became a watershed moment. It wasn't just about the quality of her work. It was about how far the perception of Amy Schumer had fallen. What had once been a comedian celebrated for her relatability was now someone audiences felt they could no longer connect with. The pay controversy wasn't just about Schumer's demands, it was also about timing. The Netflix deal came on the heels of numerous allegations of joke theft, which had already caused many to question her credibility as a comedian. With YouTube videos compiling side-by-side comparisons of her routines and those of other comedians, the allegations gained traction. While Schumer continued to deny the claims, the perception that she wasn't entirely original lingered. The combination of these controversies created a perfect storm, turning public sentiment against her in a way that felt irreversible. By this time, Schumer's response to criticism was beginning to wear thin. She frequently dismissed backlash as politically or socially motivated, blaming the alt-right or misogynistic critics for the negative feedback. While there's no denying that Schumer's bold personality and feminist stance made her a target for certain groups, her tendency to deflect all criticism began to feel disingenuous. For many, it wasn't about politics or gender, it was about the quality of her work and her attitude toward her audience. In some ways, Amy Schumer's downfall was emblematic of the challenges faced by modern celebrities. Social media had given fans unprecedented access to their idols, and the lines between performer and audience had become increasingly blurred. While this created opportunities for connection, it also meant that every misstep was magnified. For Schumer, who had built her career on being authentic and relatable. The disconnect between her public persona and her perceived entitlement felt particularly jarring. As 2018 approached, Schumer's career was still thriving in many ways. She was landing high-profile projects, her stand-up tours continued to sell tickets, and she remained a household name. But the sheen of her earlier success had worn off. The backlash wasn't just a temporary setback, it was a shift in how the public viewed her. What had once been endearing was now irritating, and the very qualities that had made her a star were the same ones pulling her down. Her story was becoming increasingly complicated. Amy Schumer wasn't just a comedian anymore. She was a lightning rod for debates about fame, entitlement, and the evolving relationship between celebrities and their audiences. For better or worse, she had become one of the most polarizing figures in comedy, a title that ironically ensured she would remain in the spotlight, even as her reputation continued to take hits. As Amy Schumer entered the later years of her career, the controversies surrounding her didn't just linger, they seemed to multiply. What started as a few critiques of her comedic style had snowballed into a full-blown reckoning with her public persona. By now, her name was less associated with groundbreaking comedy and more synonymous with polarizing debates. For some, she was a misunderstood trailblazer who refused to conform. For others, she had become the embodiment of entitlement and self-inflicted downfall. One of the most glaring controversies during this period involved her inconsistent approach to humor. Amy had always been known for pushing boundaries, but she often struggled to navigate the line between dark humor and outright insensitivity. A prime example of this was her infamous joke about Steve-O and the death of his Jackass co-star Ryan Dunn. During a roast in 2014, Schumer quipped that Steve-O must have been thinking, "Why wasn't it me?" The joke, meant to be edgy, was met with an awkward mix of laughter and groans. While Steve-O appeared to take it in stride, many felt the remark was unnecessarily cruel, especially given the circumstances of Dunn's death. What made this incident particularly damaging was the contrast it created when Schumer herself became the target of jokes. In 2016, a 17-year-old movie critic tweeted a picture with her alongside the caption, "Spent the night with Amy Schumer. Certainly not the first guy to write that." The comment, referencing her stand-up material about past relationships, was clearly intended as a light-hearted jab. But Schumer's response was anything but playful. She fired back, describing herself with very inappropriate words and criticizing the young fan publicly. The backlash to her reaction was swift. Social media erupted with comments pointing out the hypocrisy in her behavior. After all, Schumer had built her career on provocative jokes, often at others' expense. For her to lash out over a relatively tame comment felt to many like an inability to handle the same kind of humor she dished out. If she can joke about others, why can't she take a joke about herself? Became a recurring sentiment in online discussions. This inconsistency in her comedic approach was emblematic of the larger issues that plagued her career during this time. It wasn't just about jokes or politics, it was about the growing perception that Amy Schumer had lost touch with her audience. The qualities that once made her relatable, her candor, her self-deprecation, her willingness to tackle uncomfortable topics were now being interpreted as arrogance, defensiveness, and a lack of personal accountability. The allegations of joke theft that had surfaced earlier didn't help matters. Despite Schumer's repeated denials and even a polygraph test to prove her innocence, the controversy refused to die down. YouTube compilations comparing her routines to those of other comedians continued to gain views, and the accusations remained a topic of debate within the comedy community. For a comedian whose brand was built on originality and authenticity, these allegations struck at the very core of her public image. But perhaps the most telling sign of her decline was the shift in how her work was received. While her earlier specials had been celebrated for their sharp wit and fearless exploration of taboo subjects, her later performances were met with diminishing enthusiasm. Reviews of her stand-up shows and film projects increasingly focused on what they lacked rather than what they offered. Even her attempts to pivot to more serious content, such as her semi-autobiographical series Life and Beth, struggled to capture the magic of her earlier work. The show, while praised in some circles, failed to resonate with a broad audience and was eventually canceled after 2 seasons. For many, the decline of Amy Schumer's career wasn't just about her material or her public missteps. It was about a fundamental disconnect between the performer she was and the performer the public wanted her to be. Schumer had always thrived on being unapologetically herself, but as her career progressed, it seemed like she struggled to evolve in ways that kept her relatable and relevant. Yet, despite the controversies and criticisms, Amy Schumer's impact on comedy cannot be entirely dismissed. She broke barriers as a female comedian, brought conversations about body image and feminism into mainstream comedy, and inspired a new generation of performers to be bold and unapologetic. For all her missteps, she remains a significant figure in the entertainment industry, a reminder of both the possibilities and pitfalls of fame. Her story is one of contrasts, a comedian who built her career on breaking boundaries but struggled to navigate them herself. It's a tale of someone who soared to the heights of fame only to find herself grappling with the weight of public scrutiny and her own shortcomings. Whether Amy Schumer's career continues to evolve or fades into the background remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: her journey, for better or worse, has left an indelible mark on comedy. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come that far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.